because it's complex, difficult to do, and it really sets the stage for success or failure. If we analyze the intercept geometry incorrectly, and we're kind of leading up to that this is the case in this problem event. If we analyze that incorrectly, we're probably not going to succeed in combat. How do we know that we've got our bases covered? How do we know that that is in fact what the tasks are for that particular part of the mission? And we wanted to make sure now as a design team that we could confidently go to the customer and say, yeah, this is what we're dealing with here. This is the essential part of the mission. In this case, what we've done here is we've done a little validation check on our thinking. We've gone to the fighter weapons school at Nellis or at Miramar Top Gun, and we said, okay guys, what do you teach? What do you need to know? What does a fighter pilot need to know about this situation? The first thing that he learns is what the particular campaign goals are. What is the situation that he's dealing with? And then what are the general tactical objectives? Those are listed on the top. We take those and we place those in process terms. The crew in this case has to understand the situation. Now you notice down here at the bottom we have our mission objective 6.0, maneuver to intercept targets. What is the crew doing here? What is the man, the intelligence system now in our case, doing? Well, he's doing essentially three things, or performing three processes that he's taught to do in Top Gun. He's taught to understand the situation, situation awareness, and they'd have elaborate training programs to teach that. So he learns to do that process. He is also learning plan formulation. He's formulating his attack plan. Even before he acquires the target, he's got a plan that's being worked. He probably had a plan before he launched, right? Probably had an idea what his threat was going to be. So he had a plan. So he's processing a plan. And then, of course, in his maneuver, he's executing that plan. What we want to focus on today is situation understanding, or situation awareness, because that relates to this guy right here, which is analyze intercept geometry. We're going to analyze the intercept geometry within the context of trying to understand the situation. One more check. We wanted to make sure that we had enough graphics to cover our Air Force brief. And that's kind of a neat little graphic there. But it's a nice double check on our thinking, too. What we've done here is we have kind of organized our thinking in a little bit different way. We have the tasks listed along the top, as you see. And we've organized it in the context of, okay, there are certain problems that we have to solve, and there's certain solutions to the problem. There are sub-problems and there's sub-solutions, and finally we come up, hopefully, at the end here with some kind of a terminal solution that represents the problem, or that we claim solves the problem. That's all we're trying to do here, is just kind of double-check our thinking, making sure that we've got all the bases covered when we present our findings to the customer, all right? And our findings are that we have this task data now. And it's raw data because we're going to do a lot with this task data. But we have this task data. We're fairly confident that this task data represents in static form what was going on here in dynamic form. And we're going to try to give this task data, which is static, some life to it for the rest of the day. And we're going to try to use that to help us understand how to build up the conceptual design to come up with a solution. Now that's it for the mission decomposition module. What I want to do here is after each module I want to take a very short break and see if there's any questions or any comments that you might have. I like to get you know, some good interaction going on this thing. We're going to be here for a while, so we might as well enjoy ourselves. So let's do that. Obviously, we're going to be somewhat constrained because they are videotaping us, but let's try to get some, you know, thoughts out. Any comments at this point before we go into the next module, which is the critical task analysis? That module, by the way, is going to try to give some life to the static decomposition data. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
You had a list of functions that the pilot will perform in air-to-air combat in the left forward, and the last item was identify the target. It seemed to be out of order after target acquisition.
Was that the earlier, one of the earlier charts?
Yes.
It may have been. All I was trying to point out there was that you were dealing with an integrated system, okay? That these should not be viewed in isolation, but one integrates with the other. And I was trying to point out that energy management really is a task that continues through the whole maneuvering part of the mission, okay? And there are other things that impact on that. You have to do other things. You have to manage your flight path as well as manage your energy, and it becomes very complex. That's the only point I was trying to make. They may have, one of those may have been out of sequence, but the point I was trying to make was we are dealing with an integrated system here, and we've got to approach it not from the discrete component approach, but from the integrated approach that Graham was trying to explain earlier, okay? The next order of business then is critical task analysis or criticality analysis. What we need to have an idea of, we think, is now that we have these static tasks, what do you do with that? And how do these tasks relate to the success of the mission? How do they relate to such factors as task loading? What is the task loading? If you come to me and say, geez, Kevin, boy, the task load is pretty high here. I can appreciate that, and that's intuitively obvious to me because I used to teach this subject, but I can't do anything with that. Okay, high is not a good data point. So we need to get thinking about how we can quantify, analyze the mission from a quantified standpoint, try to put some values or numbers, or try to come up with a task loading value, for example, or a task interaction value that means something to us that we can use. And we can use that kind of as a discriminator, too, to look at the whole mission and find out where the critical areas are in the mission. How does one do a critical task analysis, or how does one do a criticality analysis? It's our feeling that a criticality analysis is a multidimensional construct. It involves many things. But I think we can define them. And this is a definition that we have constructed to help us come to grips with this pretty important area, critical task analysis or criticality analysis. Basically what we have is this. We have a situation where task may be difficult because of things going on. For example, there's not a lot of time to do the task. In that video we saw that there was pretty high time compression, and other things are going on. That all relates to this notion of task difficulty. We combine the notion of task difficulty with the notion of mission phase importance. The reason why we do that is because there may be some tasks that are in fact difficult, but they may not be in as an important area of the mission as other tasks. For example, in-flight refueling. In-flight refueling might be a difficult task, but it is not in a portion of the mission that is as important to mission success as, for example, this portion here that we saw in the video, which was target intercept. So that helps us discriminate between the difficult tasks and the truly critical tasks. So it gives us a number of ways to look at it. We combine those values, and we're going to give those values today. We combine those values and come up with our notion of mission criticality. And we're going to use that, hopefully, to help us in our design. We're going to use that to help us understand where to focus our design efforts. Okay, and we're going to come up with some numbers to help us. Let's leave that up there. Let me switch over to this chart for a second. First, we're going to look at the notion of task difficulty, and we think task difficulty is a three-dimensional construct, as we show here. We think task difficulty has a lot to do with time compression, or the time available to perform the mission or the task. We think it has a lot to do with interaction. Are there interacting tasks? Do you have to do two or more tasks together, for example? And then, last but not least, and maybe in fact most importantly, cognitive or processing complexity. How complex is this task to process? And we know from decision theory that some tasks are more complex to process than others. Okay, we're going to combine those using multi-attribute utility theory to come up with a number or a value or a rating, if you will, to see if we can use this to help our design. The first order of business is looking at time compression. Now, there are some tasks that have to be done very quickly, obviously. And in this case, I think, in this video case, I think we're seeing a number of tasks that have to be done very rapidly. So we have what we call a compressed time condition. Conversely, we may have other tasks, like when he was ingressing to the target, rendezvousing with his wingman. You could consider those tasks to be less compressed or in a relaxed time condition. So we have those two notions here that we're going to be playing with when we try to understand task loading. How do you analyze time compression? Simple timeline analysis would perhaps be sufficient here. Bring in a subject matter expert. Let's assume that part of the team is, in fact, subject matter experts. We have an instructor pilot from Top Gun as part of our Tiger team, and he helps us construct a timeline. The timeline can be as general as this. This is a very general timeline here that we see. The time slice that we're dealing with is 460 seconds that you see on the left. It could be a very specific timeline, like you see over here on the right. This is a complete intercept, very complex. I don't want you to read the whole thing. I just throw that up there to let you see that it can be as detailed as that. Okay? You can get right down to the, almost to the nanosecond if you wanted to. We don't really need to do that, but certainly the 0.5 seconds, okay? Because we think dwell time has to do with about 0.5 or 0.6 seconds. So we can get that detailed. And we can organize our thinking into time slots. And this is the way we've done it here in this example. This actually is a high-altitude intercept. The fighter is coming off the cap that you see on the left. He's intercepting a supersonic bomber on the right. And we've organized our thinking into time slots so that between C and D, and this is what we're going to be dealing with today, between C and D we have a time slot that we're dealing with, all right? And the time slot is 83.3 seconds, right? Everybody see that? And we can organize our thinking here. We can put this rather complex graphic in tabular form. This is just a tabular representation of what you see here for our report. All right? And we identify the time slot, and here you can see at event D, we do have that time slot of 83.3 seconds represented. We also have the time slots for the whole mission because we wanted to show the customer that we understood the whole air combat mission too, okay? So we didn't leave anything out. So that's how we look at the time compression. Now, we can analyze that using, and we have various rules and ideas, rules of thumb, of how to determine if you are in a compressed time or a relaxed time condition. Essentially what we have, remember we had the two time conditions. We had the relaxed time over here and the compressed time over here. What we need to understand then is where does that crossover occur between relaxed time to compressed time conditions? And certainly that's situation dependent, right? For example, if you were on a deck launch intercept, you may be immediately catapulted into a compressed time condition and you would stay there for the whole mission, correct? In our case here, we see that we leisurely go into the cap station and leisurely go into a holding pattern, and the compressed time condition would occur after we received the order to intercept the target and things started to happen in a rapid fashion, okay? From an analytical standpoint then, we want to look at at what point in the mission then do we have this crossover, because that's going to help us give this a value or a weight in a minute. In this case, I think we can fairly well determine that we have a crossover somewhere there in the maneuver to intercept phase of the mission. All right? Now, we really don't know what happened, but let's assume for the moment that the airplane did, in fact, come off a cap station. He was already at 22,500 feet, and then he got the intercept from the AWACS airplane. Okay, the target 11 o'clock, and then he performs a maneuver for intercept. So let's say at that point we had crossover between a relaxed time condition and a compressed time condition. See, I need to scale that. Where's my rating scale? Where's my rating scale on that, Graham? I need to scale that before. Oh, okay, I'm not going to do that yet. Okay, yeah. I got way ahead of myself for a second. All right, next one then. Done. Before we scale that, we're going to look at another factor that does, in fact, affect time compression, which is task interaction. Task interaction is simply a notion where one task will interact with another task, and that does increase task loading. And it obviously increases time compression too. So those two notions then have to be brought together before we scale them, all right? What is task interaction? In this case, we have a linear task, and there's no interaction, okay? Task A is completing his run, and he's passing the baton off to task B. There's no real interaction there except at the baton pass, but that's a linear process. Over here, we have what we call essential interaction. Task A has to function with task B. Task A could not do that alone effectively or very effectively, all right? So that's an essential interaction, and there are some tasks in the mission that have to be performed in conjunction with other tasks, all right? So we have essential interaction there. We do have a third case of interaction. It's where either an unforeseen event happens or circumstances. We call it, what do we call it? Conditional interaction. It's based upon the condition of the mission. And in this case, we do have an interaction, but it's a negative interaction, okay? It doesn't help us a bit. It really gets in the way, but it does interact. What we can do then, because we're good analysts, we can organize our thinking here and construct a task interaction matrix that you see here. And it does represent essential interaction and conditional interaction. The X actually happens to be, in this case, conditional interaction, and the dots are considered to be essential interaction for this particular type of mission. So we can organize our thinking here. We can list the interactions that are going on, and we can record them in our report. And again, okay, let me see that slide. Now, what we're going to do with this then is we're going to take the two notions of task interaction on the one hand and time compression on the other hand and put those together and give them some kind of a rating. all right? And this is a simple notion of how one might do that. Here we have 3 conditions that could occur in the mission. We have, reading from left to right, we have individual tasks being performed in a relaxed time condition, IRT. Then we have, perhaps, multiple tasks or multiple interactions that are being performed under relaxed time conditions. And finally, we have, obviously, the highest task loading portion of the mission, where we have multiple interactions going on under increased time conditions, increased time compression. All right. That receives the highest weight in our weighting scheme here. We notice that that's a pretty good discriminator then to help us understand what is the task loading in relationship to all the tasks that we have selected for our analysis. And some would be higher loading than others. Remember now we looked at task difficulty. Task difficulty was task loading plus processing complexity. Now we're going to look at processing complexity. How complex then is this task to process? Is it an easy task to do, or does it require a lot of complex processing? All right. Now from decision theory we know that a decision task is more complex from a processing standpoint than a non-decision task. And so we can look at this task set that we have identified from this perspective. We can say it is or is not a decision task, and if it is a decision task, what kind of decision task is it? And from the theoretical people, we know that there are likely 2 types of decision tasks that are going on in this particular portion of the mission. There's a type 1 decision task and a type 2 decision task. And we can discriminate the decision tasks from that standpoint. A type 1 happens to be the most complex. That's a decision task where over here, leave that up, Don. You're basically jumping into an unknown sea. You don't know what's going on. An unforeseen event has happened, and you have to, what the psychologists say, you have to restructure the schema. You have not a pre-planned action. You don't really understand what's going on, and the technical term is problem structuring. And there are a number of type 1 decisions in the air combat mission. There are things that you just don't know enough about, and you have to kind of wing it, okay? That's a type 1 decision, pretty complex, processing required, and it could represent a potential failure of the mission. If you have too many of those type 1 decisions, then you very quickly lose situation awareness. Then you would have a type 2 decision, and hopefully most of the mission is type 2 decisions because you've briefed it properly. I see Doug over there, right? We always used to brief our missions properly, right? So we were trying to eliminate as much as possible type 1 decisions, the unknown, okay? We try to understand the mission in sufficient detail so we can then process things easier. A type 2 decision is one where we know what the alternatives are, A, B, or C, and we just select the most optimum one at the time, okay? It still requires selection, so it's still pretty complex, but it's not as complex as this. All right. Now, Graham mentioned a good point. A real live example of a type 1 decision is wind shear. For years and years and years, airlines were crashing into the ground on approach or takeoff, and no one knew why. And finally, the FAA, with the help of Congress, funded a study, and they said that, okay, we've got a situation here where the pilots simply don't know what to do. The pilots were, in effect, experiencing a type 1 decision. They were never trained on wind shear, had no idea of what to do. So what they did then is they come up with a wind shear training program to try to move this thing out of the type 1 domain, which was extremely complicated to perform, to get it closer to the type 2. You're not there yet, by the way, because there are certain things that we still don't know enough about wind shear. For example, we don't know, there's no set procedure on wind shear recovery. There's some guidelines, but we still don't know how rapidly to pull up, at what rate, at what G onset, or those kinds of things, all right? But we're trying to move that out of the exclusive type 1 domain and get that closer into type 2 domain. Unfortunately, there's a lot of type 1 decisions left in the air combat area. How do we analyze the decision? We can use classic decision tree analysis. Okay, everybody familiar with that? I'm sure most people here have used a decision tree in one form or another, right? Yes? You can use classic decision tree analysis. You know, there's some criticism in using that, but it's a good way to represent what the decision might be. Here we have a very top-level decision here, okay, where you're trying to determine the attack plan and you have a very top-level decision tree constructed. This is our decision tree conventions that we could use, all right, in our decision analysis portion of this study. That's fairly well straightforward. That's, you know, that's decision analysis 101, which we all understand. This decision tree can become quite complex, and we need perhaps to get down to some additional level of complexity here. In this case, we have it's still a fairly top-level decision tree, but you notice that it is becoming more complex. There's a lot of decision nodes, a lot of decision opportunities. We notice that even some of the technologies that we've thrown into this decision tree require additional decision making. So it's a fairly complex environment. Specifically for our problem scenario that we saw in the video, this is our decision tree. And actually it's flowing, it's beginning here, and then it's completing there. And I just show this to help you orient your thinking in where we are in the mission. We want to center on this decision tree here. This is the specific decision tree that we're trying to deal with. Now, specifically what we're trying to do. So remember, we have already commenced the aspect maneuver, correct? We have already turned to the left. Remember that on the video? What are we trying to do? Well, as a crack Tiger team, we have determined that what we're trying to do is we're trying to match our target aspect angle, and we're going to get into this in detail in a minute, but we're trying to match a target aspect angle with the threat dynamics. Because if we have a good match, then we can begin to understand the intercept geometry. All right, so that becomes a decision node. In order to do that, we need to select the right maneuvering package. Now let me ask you, gentlemen and ladies, if you felt, based upon what you saw in the video, that the right maneuvering package was selected.
20/20 hindsight, no.
No. Didn't look like it anyway, right? Okay, with some, obviously some